Over the past couple of years, the legal use of psilocybin has been touted as an important and effective agent in the treatment of addiction, save one challenge. That being the cost is horrendous. In fact, it's so far out of reach for the average person and even healthcare systems, it means that the idea of using psilocybin while tantalizing is impractical. Or at least it was until Order of Canada recipient Dr. Robert Hancock, a globally renowned UBC microbiologist and Canada Research Chair in Health and Genomics, created a new process that will bring the cost to under $100 per gram by the end of 2022. Dr. Hancock says it's a game changer that will allow rapid, stable, and cost-effective psilocybin production to bring the price down and make this remarkable substance available to those in need. Dr. Hancock says the new process his team has developed uses specially constructed, optimized DNA sequences that turn bacteria into biological factories for psilocybin production within a fermentation process. And this process allows the substance to be created under or in lab-controlled conditions. This breakthrough comes in the wake of Health Canada approving the special access program use of psilocybin in psychedelically assisted therapy for mental illness, which unfortunately afflicts 1 in 5 people in Canada every year. I invited Dr. Robert Hancock to join me for a conversation that matters about the life-saving benefits of making treatment like this accessible to millions of people in desperate need. Dr. Hancock, welcome.
Thank you very much.
What led you to pursue this, research into the use of psilocybin and then to create a process that will make it accessible?
Well, I'd love to say it was based on very noble ambitions, but the truth of the matter is a friend of mine who's very interested in this mental health treatment area convinced me to help out with a company. This is not the normal sorts of things I do. Mm-hmm. I agreed to do that, and therefore I decided I had to take responsibility for it, and that's, I guess, most of the story.
Well, I think for anybody who's kind of our age, we can't help but sort of go back to thinking that Timothy Leary at one point had come along and said the use of LSD or agents within sort of the spectrum that is contained with LSD would have these kind of therapeutic benefits. But it was all illegal at the time, and his reputation was challenged. Let's be polite about it, but his life was made a living hell for doing so. What made you feel so brave that even though, despite the fact that the regulatory landscape has changed, that you were going to step into this field?
Well, the regulatory landscape hadn't changed all that much at the time I started, but in fact, when I grew up in the 60s, of course, that was the age when drugs were around. And drugs were heavily associated with harm. Mm-hmm. So it was thought they had some useful properties, but number one, they were harmful. Of course, we have a couple of drugs in our society, alcohol and tobacco, that are the most harmful drugs you can possibly imagine. But there are other things like opioids and such like, which are also harmful. The really neat thing I found out very, very early on about psilocybin is that all of the drugs that are possibly available, it is the least harmful. It is the one which has virtually no potential for harm of others. In other words, a person taking psilocybin is not likely to harm another person. And it's the one that has very, very little potential for harm to yourself. And so that's what makes it attractive to me. Originally, of course, I thought about this as like the movies I was watching in the 60s, like Beatles' Yellow Submarine, right, as a kind of a psychedelic trip. But it turns out it's so much more than that. And physicians have been learning really that it has massive potential in particular types of mental health issues, especially addiction, alcohol and opioid addiction, depression and post-traumatic stress disorder.
So how does it work? How does psilocybin have that kind of positive benefit to those who are experiencing some pretty significant challenges in their life?
So psilocybin is built on an amino acid in our body called tryptophan, and that same amino acid results in a production of a chemical that from our nerve cells that tickles the ends of those nerve cells to give certain responses. So this chemical is called serotonin.
Right.
And serotonin basically is associated with things like mood, thinking, memory,
Happiness?
feeling of reward,
Yeah.
and happiness, certainly. And so all of these things are good things, if you like. So what psilocybin is a sort of a serotonin analog, and it binds to the same receptor in your brain that is required to trigger all those different positive outcomes. And so psilocybin, in doing that, can affect a lot of different things. So in addition to sort of straightening out mood, it can also enhance memory. So it has this remarkable range of positive benefits by mimicking something that our body does naturally.
So in the treatment of mental illness or PTSD or an addiction, why is it important that the psilocybin also be associated with a therapeutic treatment? In other words, you're taking it in the care of someone who can help you navigate your way through those challenges that you may
So
or
like
may
all
not
of these
face.
things, it requires the precise amount of psilocybin, or actually the active drug is a derivative of psilocybin that is produced in your body called psilocin, but it requires the precise amount in order to have the optimum benefits. And if you have too little, you don't get as good an effect, although because it's been so expensive, a lot of psychotherapists have been using a strategy called microdosing, or using very, very small amounts, a lot. And certainly the amount of psilocybin you see in its natural source, which is the magic mushroom, is tiny, tiny amounts. And so there again, it's kind of like microdosing. So it has a little bit of an effect at low concentrations, better and more profound effect at the correct concentration. And it actually you can actually have, again, much less of an effect if you add too much. So there is a precise amount that should be done. So it's better to have a good dose, and that requires somebody advising you as to what the dose should be.
Right. So, however, getting that consistent dose and that consistent supply from an organic production is challenging.
It is, and it's challenging for many reasons. One of the major reasons being that the amount produced by any given mushroom is, quite variable.
Yeah. So, in your process, then, are you basically saying, no, we're able to bioclone and produce the psilocybin in this fermented environment?
Yeah, so the idea is forget the mushroom. So what we do is we learn from the mushroom. We take the bits and pieces that it uses to produce psilocybin, and then we reassemble them inside a bacterium.
And are you able to then ensure that you have consistency and increase output?
So firstly, the product is the pure chemical. Of course, it requires some steps to get there. Once you've got your biological factory producing the psilocybin, you have to extract that chemical from its surroundings. But that's a very straightforward process, as long as the manufacture of that chemical is fairly accurate, as long as it's in high concentrations. And once you've got it, then the pure chemical, which is made under your sort of drug rules. So I'm talking about now not about drugs, but just the normal kind of pharmaceutical rules. That is very, very consistent. And so yes, you can literally what we call titrate, or just add the exact precise dosing that you need to an individual.
And of course, then you're doing it under laboratory conditions, or clean environments that ensure that you're going to have consistency and that you're not going to have contamination, which of course you would get from organic production.
Yeah, there's a set of rules for how to make a drug in Canada, but also worldwide, that are called good manufacturing practice. And so these rules that are extremely arduous basically ensure that your production is always the same, no matter how many batches of that chemical you make. So you don't want it to have a certain purity one time and then a different purity the next time, a certain contaminant this you don't want. So you want to make sure that it's the same each time you do this.
So often when we hear about like a breakthrough like this, you hear about it, but you don't actually see it like easily accessible. Where are you at in the development of the process? I know that you've perfected it, but then where do you go from here to be able to actually get it into the hands of people who can benefit from it?
Yeah, so it's really a matter of scale up. So obviously you start originally just working in little dishes or tubes in the lab, and then you have to scale it up to these very large tubes called fermenters, which are these huge vessels that have 1,000 litres or so of liquid in them, where the bacteria can grow, and they grow in a very special way because you want them to grow to a high density, so you have lots of factory there, if you like, to produce lots of the molecule at the other end. And that means you have to feed them in a very precise fashion. You have to control the environment of those bacteria. But that's a normal thing to do in the fermentation process. So we're in the process of the scale up, and also finalising the industrial process that it will be not then probably done in our labs, but rather contracted out to one of the many fermentation agencies that exist worldwide.
Oh, so not necessarily here in Vancouver.
Well, we'll be able to get to a reasonable scale, enough drug from the scale we can do, and actually we don't do it in Vancouver. We do it in that other city, Victoria, just across the water.
Yes.
We do it in British Columbia,
Yeah,
yes.
but in southwestern British Columbia.
But we'll be producing modest amounts that will allow us to at least be able to start treating, using it within certain clinical trials and such like.
So that's where it will go next, to clinical trials, and then it'll have to be proved out. How long is that process between, the clinical trial stage to when it will actually be available to people in Canada? And then I'm sure that you have to go through a regulatory process to be able to sell it internationally as well.
Yeah, so firstly, available to people means different types of people. So available to physicians, I would say that we're very hopeful that will be sometime next year. Available to people generally requires a change in the laws. So currently...
Even still?
Yeah, even still.
Okay.
So currently, it can be used in medical practice, so it will be available to people from that perspective. But remember, this is also something that can be utilised as a recreational drug.
Yes.
And that requires a lot more, let's say, action from lawmakers. So that particular process usually follows the same process as work with marijuana, which is first the decriminalisation and then the legalisation.
Mm-hmm.
So we are seeing decriminalisation in quite a number of jurisdictions, including, for example, in Oregon, it's now decriminalised. In Austria, it's decriminalised. In Brazil, it's legal. So we're starting to see this gradually change. And I think we're lucky in a sense that we do have marijuana as an example, because it's fairly evident from everything that I've seen that psilocybin is actually much more benign, much less harmful than marijuana. And therefore, it has a chance to follow in the footsteps of marijuana, where we've seen a lot of, essentially widespread decriminalisation, and now fairly widespread legalisation too.
Right. I can't help but be thinking about the use of psilocybin in a therapeutic way, and the manner in which it can be a benefit to addressing addiction challenges. And the opioid crisis is one that makes me say, well, why aren't we fast tracking this? From your perspective, do you see where there are or why there are roadblocks to being able to make this available? Because we've got people who are at risk of losing their lives.
Yes, even though I'm not a big psilocybin guy, I'm very interested in therapy of infectious diseases, so I'm quite familiar with the clinical trials process. Mm-hmm. And I think that it has a lot of major positives, if you like. I can mention to you another drug that was brought along essentially for pain relief, a drug called thalidomide.
Right.
And that you can understand the huge implications of approving that too rapidly. So although we have really a lot of experience, a lot more experience in fact with psilocybin than they had with thalidomide, and I think we're fairly certain it's safe, I also believe that in our society we have to protect everybody by ensuring that things are properly investigated in human beings. And there are various stages of development. So there are quite a number of trials ongoing worldwide, and we ourselves at the company I work with are starting to become involved in this area also. But the idea is I think that we have to make sure those clinical studies work really well in a controlled environment. So it's not just a matter of word of mouth or, just reputation, but something where we can just say, in a hard medical way, yes, this works exactly as it should, and this is the amount we should add to a patient, and this is the frequency that they should be dosed, and these are the long-term implications. So all that stuff will come out through the clinical trials process, and I think it's appropriate.
So when it comes to a potential therapy or remedy such as this, it's not unusual for people then to say, okay, if you're going to make it that difficult, I'll go out and find it myself and self-administer. What's the risk of doing that, and why is it so important that treatment, whether it's for a mental disorder, PTSD, or an addiction, be done so in harmony with that of a trained medical professional?
So I think if you're going to consider dosing yourself, you take on the risks that are associated with that. And those risks have been seen with many, many other things that people have dosed themselves with. One of the biggest risks is the purity of the compound and whether there are other things together with firstly, if it's even the compound you think it is, if you buy it on the black market, and if it is the compound you think it is, whether it's contaminated with something else that might actually physically cause harm. I think the third and important aspect is also that going along the same line is price. So you may end up paying a lot more for access to this drug than you would otherwise. So I think right now this is probably going it yourself is you take some risks, and those risks range, as I said, from supply through to whether you're going to get the right dose, the right amount into you to really have an effect. And because of that, basically, I believe that the best route forward, if you really want to hurry things along, would be to start to get involved in a clinical trial. Canada has given special permission to physicians to utilize psilocybin in therapy where they feel it's appropriate, and I think physicians are in the best place to make that call, if you like, whether it's something that can actually help you. Because I'm not trying to sell this as a drug that affects everyone. It's not a magic bullet. It's not going. It's not going to be. It's not going to be the panacea for everybody. But I think that generally speaking, as long as there are like legal medical routes to getting access to the drug, and especially during that clinical trials process, usually, or that developmental process, the drug is usually often given away.
Right. Yeah, because it's still at that trial stage.
Yeah.
So there's going to be somebody who's watching this right now saying, okay, that's nice, that's nice. How do I get into those clinical trials? Is there a process that one can follow?
Well, usually, so there are all sorts of ways that people recruit people, but they usually recruit them primarily through trained practitioners, in other words, physicians who are actually involved in mental illness. So I think the best thing is to speak to the physician that you're talking to about your particular mental condition.
Mm-hmm. So I got to ask you, this is just a little like left-hand turn, only because I am impressed and want to encourage this kind of research and work being done here in southwestern British Columbia. What is it about the community here that we seem to be seeing one breakthrough after another in life sciences and biomedical engineering and the work that you're doing? Have we developed a community that we have just the right talent to be able to produce, processes and products of this kind of quality?
So I believe that all of those things are true. So
Yeah.
firstly, University of British Columbia is one of the top 30 universities in the world.
Right.
So we may not have as stellar a reputation as Harvard or Oxford and Cambridge or something like that, but we are a top university, and that means in some areas we are, in the best 4 or 5 universities in the world for that particular sub area. I think that we have another huge advantage. So science has become very international and people mingle a lot, although maybe not so much in the COVID era, but they mingle a lot. And so it's really difficult sometimes to, above this sort of clamour of other voices, to actually think yourself about stuff. And I think that we just have the right amount of isolation. We're just a little bit off the beaten track. We're not in one of the major, metropolitan centres, and it allows us to think a bit. And I think that combination of being able to attract the top people, but not being over-influenced by other voices, has really allowed British Columbia to shine. I think the other thing is we have a huge reputation for company building in British Columbia. We built, I think, 3 or 4 of the top 20 companies in the world, and right now we've had massive impacts on pharmaceutical development, of which, of course, the one that people would be most familiar with is the contributions of our professor in biochemistry at UBC, Peter Cullis, who actually created the liposomes that are required for the Pfizer vaccine to work against COVID.
Right.
So, and really for the ones for the Moderna vaccine were just blueprinted off his ideas. So, we are able to, we're able to do stuff because we're pretty good scientifically, but we also just have that ability to have quiet time to think.
Yeah. Well, I think you're absolutely right, and I'm going to be an unabashed, cheerleader for what we're doing here. I see it in so many. The community in the life sciences, biomedical engineering, research is just growing and attracting more and more talent to come here. And I think that what you're doing is wonderful on its own, but it's part of a bigger story as well.
Yeah, it's a lovely place to do science, to tell the truth, because I know most of the guys around in this community, and we collaborate a lot. We work together really well. That's not so easy for, especially big labs, the Harvard labs and stuff. They tend to work in silos or isolated from the rest of their community. We just collaborate a lot, and it's a fun place to do science.
Well, it's wonderful. Thank you. Thanks for coming in also and bringing us, this fantastic information about the breakthroughs that you and your team have been making.
Thank you. My pleasure.